You guys ever have one of those weeks where nothing can go right? One of those weeks that stuff just doesn't seem to want to work out, or one thing happens and then another thing happens. Well, I've currently had one of those weeks. It's kind of been couple different things. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but here lately there's been a big storm supposedly going to push across the U.S., and it's been hyped up, really hyped up. And so, there's a lot of fear tactics and everything like that came into play. And then, the panic purchases and just people trying to get prepared. But amidst of all that, to start the week off about Monday night, went to sleep, everything's fine. It's a pretty good day so far. Went to work, went to sleep, woke up the next morning. I had a bad pain in my nose, and I was like, that doesn't feel good. And so I went to work, and it was real sensitive, real painful. It stayed like that all day, and I developed like a headache, pretty bad headache. It kept coming, and it seemed like it was worse when I had my glasses on. And so, I worked 12 hours a day, so I didn't see it until I got in that night. And so I got in that night, and you couldn't really see it from the outside because it was in the inside of my nose. And I don't know if it was something to start off with, like maybe a pimple or a ingrown hair or something. I don't really know how it started, but I went to sleep, and I put some medicine on. I put some colloidal silver on it that night, which I've had good luck with in the past, and it didn't go away. So I gave it another day. Tuesday comes around, it's still terrible headache. So now this is day 2 with the headache that's just set in real bad. And so, I knew that something wasn't right. And in the past, I've had a history of something called MRSA, which is basically like a resistant, staph infection. I haven't had the best of luck with it. I think when I was back in 2015, I think I got my first case of it. I think back then it came from a spider bite, and they cut it out of my leg. And then, they treated it with antibiotics, and antibiotics really doesn't do good treating it. So it's really a hard thing to treat. And so they cut it out and drained it and then put some packing in it. And then I got a blister on my foot maybe 2 weeks later, but the other infection hadn't healed, hadn't healed all the way. So it ended up moving to my other foot. And back then, it got pretty bad, and I went to the hospital, and they kind of just brushed me off. I went to the urgent care twice for that one first, and then I went to the hospital. They kind of sent me home, and they kept sending me home, but they weren't actually cutting the infection out or draining or anything. They were just sending you home with, antibiotics. And so that went on 2 more times, and then on the 3rd time, they put me into an emergency, surgery. We went in, they put me to sleep, they went in, they cut it out. And as a result of that, I had to spend about 5 days in the hospital, 2 days in the ER, 5 days in the hospital monitoring the infection. And I think they, at the time, if I remember correctly, they put 175 foot of packing in that foot. And so that was kind of hard to go through because I was frustrated because I told the hospital 2 times, hey, I've had this MRSA infection. This is what it is. We got to do something. It's getting worse. And I was having to go to work every day, so I was working on it. And it was getting really frustrating because they wouldn't listen to me. But then on that 3rd time, they finally did listen to me. But that resulted in having to be hospitalized over it because, whether or not they wouldn't hear me or didn't take it serious, or what I realized on this one is what the real reason, and I'll get to why they wouldn't admit me in a little while, and why I think there's a brokenness in our medical system, and why people are able to get so bad and potentially have real bad consequences because of our lack of care, or maybe hands tied, kind of like, if you go to another country and you're engaged in war, you have rules that you can't break even if you're over there, because it's still rules here. And our medical system has those same rules to an extent of stuff they are and aren't allowed to do, and who they are and aren't allowed to accept, and at what stage they are and aren't allowed to accept, which is kind of crazy, but maybe there's more to it that I don't know. But anyway, so they cut it out, they drain it. And so it had been a while. So this was about 2016 when that last infection happened. So we're currently in 2026. And so It's been a good long time since I last had one of these infections, and you can kind of feel it. Even the spots that I've had cut out in the past, it's still got tenderness. I guess where the infection had ate down into the skin, and even though the pocket closed, I don't know if it ate through some of the tissue or it's still very tender. Like the inside of my thighs are real tender from it. It's never like got 100% where there's no pain left, especially if you push where it was at, whether it's the bottom of my foot or in my leg. But it had a real sharp pain to it. So I started off and I went. The first day I went was Wednesday. On Wednesday, I knew something was wrong. So I left work and I went to the emergency room, which I know a lot of people's like, why would you go to the emergency room over that? But, from past things, I knew in my head that this was an MRSA infection. Even the people around me, obviously people are like, oh, no, I think it's this. And I might have a history of, thinking something's wrong when it ain't. But I just had a feeling that I could feel it. And I knew that there wasn't something right. So I go into the emergency room because I called my personal care physicians and they never called me back. So the only other place I know to go to, I know the urgent care can't do nothing for it. So I go into the emergency room and they kind of brush it off. I think they were thinking it was more like a pimple and I wish it was, I wish it would have been. So I go in there and like I said, I went to the same hospital that treated it the last time and they didn't, they came and looked at me. They moved me to a fast track room and this nurse came up and she was talking to me a little bit. I never seen an actual doctor the first time. And so she looked at it and she was like, well, there's nothing I can, it was bubble. Like you could see the redness and you could feel a bubble on the outside of the nose. It was very sensitive, but it was in the infection, like the sore was in the inside and you could see the entrance to the sore, but the bubble was kind of deep, MRSA will burrow and it kind of goes deeper to keep from getting, I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but to my knowledge, it burrows down so, it can fester. And so I told her that, and she was like, well, it looks good on the outside. There's nothing I can really do. And I was like, well, I can feel it in there. I know it's not all out. And she was like, well, no, I think it's out. So she gave me some antibiotics and, sent me on my way. So I go home, go get the antibiotics. I later found out that the antibiotics they gave me for was on my chart that didn't work the first time I had an MRSA infection, and nobody noticed that until the second trip. They didn't put in they didn't do their due diligence to find it out. So I go in and I go home the next day. It's getting redder. It's swelling and like the side of my nose. I don't know if it's a sinus pocket or a lymph node or whatever, but on the side of my nose, it was swelling up on one side, but not the other side. So when I would wear my glasses, it put a constant pinch on the edge of my nose where it's swelling. And that pressure was just like making my head just really hurt. And so I went into work. I didn't even make it. I didn't even do anything. I ended up going back home. So I drove about 120 miles to work because I work out of town. And then I ended up driving 120 miles back to the house. So I was trying to make it. They told me to come back in 48 hours if it didn't get no better or if it got worse. The night before, I think I was running a slight fever. I think I was running about a 101. And so I went to the grocery store and I was like, I think I need to go back. So leave the grocery store, go back to the emergency room. And I told him, I said, hey, I was here the other day. These are my symptoms. I got a lot more swelling on the right side of my face. And this is kind of what has been going on. And so they looked at me. The first time I went in, they let me sit there forever because I don't think they thought it was important or anything. And so they moved me to a room. Well, the lady comes and talks to me in less than 2 minutes after, when they did my blood pressure was 147/97, and it was dinging on the machine. And the lady was asking her, are you in a lot of pain right now or something? And I was like, well, I got a really bad headache. And if I wear my glasses, it's pretty excruciating. But, there was a lot of swelling and everything. So They moved me into the or she comes and looks at it, and she says she was just trying to get everything ready. So she comes and looks at it, and then they moved me to the same fast track room as the day before, but they moved me in there in about 3 or 4 minutes of arrival. So it was a lot quicker. They sit me down at a table, and maybe 10, 15 minutes later, a doctor, I guess it was I don't know if he's a full doctor or if he's a nurse. I want to say it said PA, but maybe it didn't. I forget what abbreviation he had, but he had some kind of abbreviation. So he took me back to this, like, you're in this fast track room. So there's about 20 chairs that recline in there, which would be like the chair you would have if you were having a baby. That'd be in the side of the room for you to, probably it's in a lot of hospitals. If you wanted to relax, it could lay all the way down. And so you're sitting in this chair and they move you to like this corner that's kind of cubicled off, and he's talking to me and he's like, well, you haven't really been on the antibiotics long. And I was like, I know, but it's actively getting worse. And I've been through this before and you guys didn't take it serious. And it cost me 5 days in the 2 days in the emergency room, 5 days total. And I think before insurance, the total cost was somewhere around $250,000. And I was like, I don't want to go through that again, especially when we could get it early and we should be able to take care of it now. And he's like, look, I'm looking at your record. I was like, if you go back to 2016 on February the 26th, I was admitted in this hospital for this exact same thing. So he went back and he's able to pull up the records. And that's when he found out that medicine that they were treating me with currently was on the list of medicine that didn't work the last time. So that was the first step. Okay, we need to change that. And so I was telling him, there's a lot more swelling here. And I've been documenting it kind of like if, I was documenting with pictures, but basically the same thing. If you got like bit by a poisonous snake, the progression of how much it's going, it's getting and changing. And he was like, I agree with you. I think he said, if it was up to me, I'd want to admit you because we obviously know how it went last time. And I think it's probably would go the same way this time. He said, but having said that, the hospital is not going to let me admit you if you don't have like he said, I got to sell, I have to be able to sell it to the hospital to get you admitted on why you deserve a spot to be admitted at the hospital. And he said, unless it was to the point of if it was something like cellulitis that was covering the majority of your face, or if you were in the stages of sepsis, I would have, I could sell it to the hospital to admit you. And I was like, I don't want to, I don't personally, the way I was thinking, I was like, I don't want to let it get to that because, the last time I've had these kind of infection, it has been in my feet. And, there's a lot of real estate between your feet and your head on an infection getting into your blood or your brain or your heart or something like that. Now, we're a lot closer. We're on my face. If it's in my nose, I mean, how many inches is that from your brain? And I was like, I don't think that's a good idea. And I don't think we should let it get to a real bad point and then to try to treat it. And he was like, well, I have noticed that, I noticed that the medicine that you're currently on was not working the last time. So he said, I'm going to change that. And if we could do like a 1-2 punch of this medicine and this medicine to kind of knock it out. And I said, yeah, that would work good. But it's got to be cut out or something. He's like, well, I know that. And normally if I could admit you, I could put you to sleep and cut it out. And he said, but, without being able to admit you, I can do it. But, you know, something about me is my body doesn't really numb like it should. And so I've never been able to numb. Obviously, that was in my chart. He said, so I'm probably not going to be able to get you numb to be able to where you're not going to feel it. So I can, I can get into the pocket to drain it, but it's going to be real painful. I didn't really want to do that, but I was like, there's really no choice because it's either going to get bad and it could potentially put me at a real bad health risk, or we could kind of address it now. So I said, if whatever we got to do, we're going to need to do it. I don't want to do that. That's going to be really painful. And it was really painful, but I'll get into that in a second. So but I was like, well, one thing that does work really good for an infection is an IV antibiotic. So I said, while I'm here, what if we go ahead and run one IV antibiotics? And he said, yeah, that's fine. We can do that. So they start me up on the IV antibiotic. Yeah, I don't really numb, but he did try. I'll give it to him. He tried to numb me. He gave me in my IV, they put some morphine, which didn't do anything but make me really dizzy. It was actually the first time, I think, well, at least the first time in a long time that I can't remember when I was 19 if they gave me morphine or not, but it didn't do anything for me. It just made me feel real nauseous and sick. But they put it straight to the IV, so I don't know if it was the way they put it in, and that's why it made me feel like that. But so they put the IV in and they run the IV. And so I'm sitting there for a pretty good while. And, the anticipation is starting to build up. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a fan of needles anyway. So they already just put they put the IV in, and that kind of, it is what it is. Luckily, the guy that put it in was pretty good. He caught it the first try, but my veins usually roll. So normally it's about 3 or 4 times they got to go around to get it. So he got it on the first try. So you're sitting there and it's kind of just building up, and that anticipation is building up because it's going to hurt. So he comes back over there maybe 30, 40 minutes later. He says, you ready? And I said, well, not really, but ah, let's go. And so they take me back there. So the thought process is, in your nose is really not that much meat. So we weren't going to cut it. He was going to stick a needle in there, a smaller needle to start with, and try to numb it and see if it would work, which it didn't work. And so he stuck the first needle in there, and now the nose is really it was sensitive enough that as soon as you touch it, like just light brushing, your eyes would be watering, very painful. You couldn't touch it when you sleep. It was a real painful area, and it was kind of radiating from like the tip of your nose down to the side of your nose into your cheek a little bit, and then from the point of your nose to the top about mid eyebrow level, but all, on the left side of my face, it was good. There was no pain there, but it was all on the right side and the right side only. So he, he brought me over there. So he stuck the needle in, the small needle that he was going to try to numb it with. And I think it flushed it out a little bit, but it was really like, there wasn't nothing to hold you down. So I was trying to not jump. So immediately my eyes just started watering real bad. And so he sprays, I couldn't tell you what medicine it was, but it was meant to numb. So he sprayed it in there and he squeezed it. And immediately he was like, man, there's a lot of pus coming out. So when he pulled that one out, he took and went ahead and took a swab of it to get a culture, because the culture is going to show you how you can, what you have and what could treat that specific infection, because most antibiotics won't treat it. So he cultured it and he took it away. And I feel like he waited a little too long, but he's like, all right. So the goal was to get the biggest needle they had at the hospital for the second needle that went into it, to open up the hole wide to get any infection. So we pushed it all the way through to the infection pocket. And that was the goal, was to, get as much out that way instead of something like traditional where they would cut it, because obviously it's a lot smaller in your nose than it would be in your foot. And so he's like, do some breathing. He's like, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe. And we did it like 6 times. And I was thinking, let's just go. So he finally pushes it through. And the pain is really immense at this point. You can feel everything. Like I said, your eyes are just pouring water just a sharp pain. So he goes way in there and he pulls it out, and then he immediately starts squeezing it, trying to drain the infection out. Terrible pain though. Like I said, it was really bad. So we get all that out. He gets his culture, he sends it off, and he cleans my nose up a little bit. And as he's doing this, there was another doctor, standing in the background cringing. And I was thinking, if you think it's bad on that side, you should be over here in this seat. It's rough on this side. And so, they moved me back in. I think the IV antibiotics took 3 hours. So at this point, we're about an hour in, 3 hours. And so I basically had to beg them though to do that because originally he wanted to just send me home, and in the past I've only had I've only seen luck with MRSA when you cut the infection out, clean it out, and then controlled the closure. Well, obviously, in your nose, it wasn't closing fast enough, but in my foot, it was so big that you couldn't have just cut it, drained it, and left it because it would have closed up and then it would have festered on something else. So that's why you had the packing in there to pack it and the slow, the to keep the closure of the hole at a maintained speed to where you could keep cutting it out and pulling that stuff out as you go. And so he kind of bandaged me up, and I went back, sat down, and did all that, and then they sent me home. And so this is about at this point, I think I got there around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So we're sitting about 7 o'clock in the evening now, and so we ended up going to my parents to get something, and then we went to the pharmacy. And now, like I said, this is in the part, and there's a big snowstorm coming. So everybody's going crazy. They're trying to get their prescriptions because they're telling us on the radio in the midst of all of this, hey, this is going to be the worst storm in 150 years. And this it could be bad. We could be out of power for a month. And, you got all these people running around, and here I am. I just got an infection cut out of my nose, and I'm a little irritable. I'm not gonna lie. I've been in the hospital for a while. This is the second day. They didn't take me serious the first day, and then you got all the pain that came along with it, and the pain that was there before, just normal. So I go in there, and there's a line, probably 20 people long. And like I said, this is when we got back to the pharmacy, it was about 8:50 at night. So this is PM, and there's about 20 people in the line. So I take them in there, and as I'm going up there, I need to start taking this medicine that night. Obviously, is what it said on my discharge papers. So I go up to the counter, and people dropping off their stuff, and I heard them tell the two people in front of me, it'll be like an hour, 2 hours before you get it. Which at this point it was 8:50 at night, so that'd put it at 10:50, which would have been bad, but not too bad. And so I get up to the counter, and I hand the lady my prescriptions, and they prescribed me like two pain management, like a Tylenol, but like a bigger version. And I think the other one was like an ibuprofen, but it was obviously a higher milligram ibuprofen than what you could buy in a normal bottle. And then the two prescriptions, one was to treat MRSA, and then one was to treat anything else that could be, even though it didn't have any benefits to treating MRSA. And so I give the lady my paper, and she was like, it's going to be 1 to 3 hours is what she told me. And I was like, I need this, I need to take it on this paper. It says I need to take it before 12. And they were like, well, I could see if I could fast track it. So she goes to the guy, I guess the main pharmacy guy, and he's like, oh, I can't get this filled until 7 a.m. And I was like, I don't, and I was irritable. And I was like, I don't have time to wait till 7 a.m. I just had an infection cut out of my nose. I just need to get this med. Is there anything we can do? And he's like, what would you want me to do? There's 300 people here. And, obviously he was exaggerating, which there was a good amount of people there. But so I was like, I'm just doing what the hospital said. They told me to come here. And he said, of course they did, because we're the only ones open. And I said, listen, sir, I'm just trying to get it filled. And so I said, I'll call them and see if they can do anything. He says, well, I don't care what they say. It ain't going to get done any faster. So I ended up calling the hospital. I was like, hey, you guys sent me medicine, and this guy's saying he can't get it done until 7 o'clock in the morning. The lady's like, that's unacceptable. No, that's not going to work. And so she said, well, let me patch you into the doctor that, the guy that you were working with when you were here. And so he was like, well, since you did do the antibiotics and it was a 3 hour, you'll be okay until the morning. Just get it first thing in the morning and start taking it as soon as possible. And so I go home, and the infection did start in the morning. It did look a good amount better after we drained it, because it was like right after it was really red and inflamed. And so I go and, get the medicine and start taking it. And, like any antibiotics, heavy antibiotic, it really makes your stomach hurt. So, I went and got that and started taking it, and it has come down. But in the midst of all this other stuff going on, so, I've kind of missed work for that. And then you got all this, craziness going on about buying food and water and then generators. And you got all these people, talking about this storm and, kind of what I run heavy equipment for a living and I strictly work for power companies clearing land for transmission lines. And so normally when there's a storm, we're going to get called in on some kind of storm details. So I was kind of already, worrying about that. I got an infection in my nose. The culture hadn't come back yet to determine what it is. So we're still kind of shooting in the dark on if this medicine is going to work for this kind of infection or not work. So I was kind of scared to leave for that. And then also, nobody wants to leave their family in an emergency like that. So you got all this stuff going on. The generators are going, the heaters are going, food, water, you know, everything that people want. And then you got the news outlets that are talking about this storm. So, you're dealing with that. And then the first day comes and not much happens. So Friday night, not much happens. They're like, oh, it's going to come Saturday and the Sunday. And then Saturday and the Sunday comes and, not much happens here either. And then, oh, well, it's going to be Sunday night. So I didn't go on storm detail until Sunday. But the other guys went Saturday. So they were there a day before me. I showed up Sunday. And so on Sunday, when I get there, a couple hours later, it started really coming down pretty good with freezing rain. But at this time, it was probably 30, 34, 33 degrees outside, but it was freezing. So it started coming down pretty fast. So we ended up leaving where we were sitting and we went back to an apartment we have for out of town because we were pretty close to where we were working stationed. And so we went back to our out of town apartment and, it had been coming down pretty good when we left. So about 20 miles an hour, real deep sludge and snow. So the thought was that night it's going to freeze and then it's going to be a 30-mile-an-hour wind and it could be bad for everybody. And so we wake up. What was weird is when the sun went down, the temperature kind of rise. It started like, it was like 34 and then it almost went up to 40. And I don't know if maybe the storm was pushing it through and or the heat was rising, but like, it had dumped a lot of freezing rain and rain. So there's a lot of moisture out. So if the temperature drops like it said it was going to drop, it's going to be bad ice. And so the power ends up going out at the apartment right when we get there. And in this community, there's gates to get in and out. And so they didn't think about the fact that if the power goes out, now the gates are closed. So the power goes out, the gates won't open. So now there's residents in there that can't get in and can't get out. And it didn't take them long, about 20 minutes. They waited. And then now we're taking the arms off the gate and we're manually open. Not me, but some other residents. I was watching them out off my balcony. So they're taking it out. So they get the gate open. And then maybe about 2 hours later, the power came back on. So then, you go to bed because you're still on active storm detail. You just weren't, you couldn't sit out there all night. You would just go back to your tractors in the or your staging area in the morning after the storm passed, and then you'd be, dispatched from there. So we wake up in the morning, looks way better than it did the day before. And I remind you that they've been hyping up this storm on Facebook, TikTok. All these meteorologists are going live on TikTok, Facebook. I mean, these people are just saying craziness to the point that, I was like, well, man, I don't like being cold. So I started off, I went out and bought before, while I was dealing with this infection and I wasn't at work, I went ahead and got some sleeping bags. I was like, well, I can't afford a generator because they're really high. So I was like, well, if I'm going to be cold, our thought process was, I'll fill my truck up and then I will fill my, if it gets too cold, I'll stay in the truck. But then I was like, well, if I can't stay in the truck forever, so I'll go ahead and get some really cold weather sleeping bags. And worst case scenario, we're going to sleep in these sleeping bags. And so I got that. I ended up going to the store the next day. They ended up having some generators because I had been looking for one, but they had been sold out everywhere. Because, like I said, they've been hyping this storm up, and they hyped it up for so long. People were getting scared because my entire life, I'm 28. All I've heard about is how bad the blizzard of '93 was going to be, and how bad it was. And so they're saying this is going to be way worse than that. And everybody I know said that was worse. So I was thinking, hey, that's problematic. I don't like being cold. And like I said, I got this infection going on in my face. So I don't know if you guys ever, when you get cold, stuff hurts worse. And so I ended up going to the store the next day and I got a generator. It kind of was crazy because the generator was $1,099, and then they just so happened to be running a random sale that was just so happened to be on the exact weekend all this happened. So I ended up getting, it was $1,175 after taxes, but then the sale dropped it down to $855. So I got this pretty good generator for $855, but it didn't do nothing. Nothing happened. And so that's kind of what's been going on lately. And, I kind of wanted to make an episode just to kind of talk about what's currently went on, at least in this week of ventures for me. I kind of did dislike the fact that our medical system is willing to let it get to a point like sepsis or cellulitis in your face before they're willing to admit you, even though on paper that it says that it could, not on paper, but in the past, it had got to the point where I had to be hospitalized, and we weren't willing to look at that. We were only willing to, if they wouldn't have cut it out, this infection would still be growing right now. And like I said, I had to kind of I had to kind of plead my case, like, we got to do something, we got to cut it out. And I get he didn't want to cut it out because it was going to hurt, but, we didn't have no choice, and it did hurt really bad. It was probably one of the worst pains I've ever felt with. But it got me thinking on between these two events, how, how many people go through something and suffer, and we either just let it happen, or we maybe make the symptoms worse by not taking it serious. And so on one day, on one hand, the hospital wasn't taking it serious for what I had going on with this infection. And then on the other hand, people were taking it so serious on the storm that, that everything's getting sold out. Well, the infection turned out to be something, and we got that dealt with, and then the snowstorm turned out to be nothing. And so it kind of put it in my head as like, I was thinking, our medical system is terrible, but I guess looking back at it, it does stink that they can't do something because of, the rules of engagement with admitting somebody in, if that's what you call them, and that might not be the right terminology. But it's kinda like this snowstorm. If they would have admitted me and it turned out to be nothing, then they would have wasted their time. But if they did nothing, then it could have made it worse. Just kinda like this snowstorm, everybody went out and prepared, and then now nothing really happened. And there are some areas that did get really messed up, but the majority, especially around where I, live, it wasn't bad at all. There's a couple states bordering around where I'm at that were pretty bad, but where I live, it wasn't really bad at all. And so obviously now people are trying to return the heaters and the generators and everything they bought, which is kind of crazy. I think you could probably keep that kind of stuff just in case you ever needed it, or anything you bought. Obviously, people went out and bought food because, we're talking about not having no power for a month or so. So obviously people, if they were, you know, thinking about it, they would have bought as much food as possible, in my opinion. And that's what I went and did. I bought as much, you know, beef stew and rice, pasta, sandwiches, stuff that you could eat if there was no power and then water, clean gallon jugs of water, because even though if the power goes out, the water's still going to work. You never know, something could happen and they could get and so we just got some clean drinking water. And so, that's kind of what's went on this week. And that's kind of the adventures between an infection in your nose and a snowstorm that, every time a big snow event here happens, they call it Snowmageddon. And we use the same name over and over for some reason. And, we don't live in a place that ever really gets snow. And if we do get snow, the bread and milk's gone and people can't, over here, as soon as it starts raining, people are using their emergency flashers because they can't drive in the rain. So imagine what snow looks like here. And so, like I said, that's just a little bit about what happened this week, and then between the infection and the snowstorm and everything else, it's been a little hectic week, and that's kind of what I had. And I'd love to hear back from some of you guys, hear your thoughts and everything on what you think about if you've went through a similar situation with the hospital not taking you serious on something that was a medical problem, infection, something that you didn't think was right and they wouldn't listen to you and then it turned out to be something good. And for anybody that could be listened to, maybe listen to people a little bit more, be willing to listen to their side instead of just putting them in a bracket or putting them in a you know where you're not listen to what they're saying and actually look into what they're saying because it could be something. And if it's nothing, it's nothing, but at least you took the time to check it out. So thank you guys for listening. And that's just a little bit of what went on this week.